In the seemingly peaceful town of Salsbury, Maryland, where everyone knows each other's business, a tragedy was about to unravel that would shake the very foundation of the community. Aaron Cole, a 26-year-old artist, was found dead under mysterious circumstances, sending shockwaves through the town. But the real bombshell wasn't just his untimely death. It was the involvement of the town's beloved doctor, Meredith Larsson. For over 40 years, she had been the trusted, nurturing physician who treated generations of families, earning the respect and admiration of everyone. Yet beneath her calm, caring exterior lay a dark secret. Aaron's death would unravel a hidden web of dangerous liaisons and emotional manipulation that linked Meredith to three younger men. What began as a quiet tragedy soon spiraled into a tale of obsession, deceit, and betrayal that no one in Salsbury could have imagined, forcing the town to confront the chilling truth behind their once revered doctor. Dr. Meredith Larsson had long been a pillar of the Salsbury community, known for her unwavering dedication and compassionate care. With over 40 years of medical practice, she had become more than just a doctor. She was a maternal figure to many, having treated generations of families in the small town. Patients trusted her implicitly, and her calm, professional demeanor gave them comfort, knowing they were in capable hands. To the outside world, Meredith was the embodiment of respectability and stability. But behind closed doors, her personal life told a different story. Meredith's marriage had ended years ago, leaving her emotionally adrift. As she neared retirement, the once fulfilling career that had brought her so much satisfaction began to feel hollow. Her large home, once filled with warmth, now echoed with emptiness. With no children to care for and no close family ties, Meredith found herself longing for something more, something that went beyond the routine of diagnosing ailments and writing prescriptions. Her loneliness began to gnaw at her, creating a void that neither her work nor her reputation could fill. Beneath the surface of her calm exterior, Meredith was emotionally unfulfilled, vulnerable and searching for a deeper connection that would ultimately lead her down a dangerous path. Dr. Meredith Larsson, a woman who had built her life around professionalism and care, found herself crossing dangerous boundaries as her loneliness deepened. It all began with Matthew Granger, a 31-year-old personal trainer who first entered her clinic for help recovering from a shoulder injury. Matthew was everything Meredith hadn't experienced in years: confident, youthful, and flirtatious. At first, she brushed off his charm as harmless. But as their conversations grew more personal, Meredith found herself drawn to him. Matthew, skilled in getting what he wanted, slowly seduced her, and what began as light banter turned into a full-blown affair. For the first time in years, Meredith felt alive, desired, and young again. As her relationship with Matthew intensified, Meredith found herself pulled in a different direction by another patient, Daniel Ward. Daniel, at 28, was the complete opposite of Matthew. He was emotionally fragile, struggling with severe anxiety and depression. He looked to Meredith not just as his doctor, but as his emotional anchor. Their sessions grew longer, filled with personal confessions, and soon Meredith found herself offering him more than just medical advice. She became his confidant, his emotional crutch, blurring the lines between doctor and caretaker. His dependency on her became an addiction she couldn't shake. Then came Aaron Cole, the youngest of the three men, at 26. An artist with a volatile personality, Aaron was driven by his emotions and consumed by his obsession with Meredith. His intensity frightened and intrigued her at the same time. He would show up at her office unannounced, demanding her attention, and while Meredith tried to maintain professional boundaries, the pull of his passion was too strong to resist. With each man, Meredith's involvement grew deeper, and the boundaries between her professional life and personal desires crumbled. What began as secret affairs spiraled into dangerous emotional entanglements that she struggled to control. Dr. Meredith Larsson's life had always been one of control and order, carefully balancing her professional responsibilities with her role as a trusted figure in the small town of Salsbury. However, as her secret affairs with Matthew, Daniel, and Aaron deepened, that carefully constructed balance began to collapse. What had initially been an exhilarating escape from her loneliness was quickly turning into a nightmare. Meredith juggled the three relationships with increasing difficulty, Each man came with his own unique needs and demands, pulling her in different directions. It wasn't long before the tension of keeping her personal life hidden from the world and from the men themselves began to take a toll on her both emotionally and professionally. The once confident doctor was now constantly looking over her shoulder, consumed with anxiety about when her secrets might unravel. Matthew Granger, the personal trainer, had been the first to draw Meredith into this web. His confidence and charm were intoxicating at first, but his desire for control soon emerged. Matthew was possessive, growing increasingly suspicious of Meredith's time and attention. He didn't like to share her, and his jealousy began to show in aggressive ways. Matthew would call her late at night, demand more of her time, and even show up at her clinic unannounced. His demands for her affection, combined with his need to assert dominance in their relationship, left Meredith feeling trapped. While she had once felt flattered by his intense focus on her, now it was suffocating. At the same time, her involvement with Daniel Ward was becoming equally problematic, though in a different way. Daniel was emotionally fragile, deeply dependent on Meredith, not just as his doctor, but as his emotional lifeline. He struggled with anxiety and depression, and Meredith had crossed the line from professional support to something far more personal. Daniel called her often, sometimes just to hear her voice or seek comfort during his anxiety attacks. Meredith found it difficult to turn him away, feeling a sense of responsibility for his well-being. However, his constant need for reassurance was overwhelming, and the emotional burden of their relationship began to weigh heavily on her own. Daniel's dependency on her grew with each passing day, and Meredith knew that cutting him off would likely cause him even greater distress. But she was slowly drowning in his neediness, torn between her guilt and the realization that she was losing control. Then there was Aaron Cole, the volatile artist whose unpredictable behavior terrified and fascinated her. Aaron's obsession with Meredith was far more intense than anything she had experienced with the other two men. His mood swings were extreme. One moment he was passionately declaring his love, and the next he was angry, erratic, and demanding. He would show up at her house unannounced, leave notes on her car, and lurk outside her clinic for hours. Despite her attempts to keep him at arm's length, his intensity was hard to resist. There was something about his artistic temperament, his raw passion, that drew her in, even though she knew it was dangerous. As the pressure mounted, Meredith's life became a delicate balancing act, and she was running out of ways to keep her affairs hidden. Each man was becoming more possessive, and the strain of managing their emotions, and her own, was starting to show. Matthew's jealousy grew stronger, and he began to suspect that Meredith was hiding something from him. Daniel's anxiety worsened, and his calls became more frequent and desperate. Aaron's obsession with her spiraled further, and his threats to expose their relationship loomed large. Meredith's once ordered and controlled life was now spiraling into chaos. The more she tried to compartmentalize these relationships, the more tangled they became. She was trapped, unable to let go of the men who had become such a central part of her world, yet terrified of the consequences if they discovered the truth about one another. Her double life had grown too complex, and the emotional strain was becoming unbearable. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. As time went on, the tension in Dr. Meredith Larsson's life grew unbearable. The once thrilling excitement of juggling 3 secret relationships now turned into a web of lies, jealousy, and fear. The delicate balance she had tried to maintain was crumbling, and each man in her life was demanding more than she could give. Matthew Granger, the confident personal trainer, was the first to grow suspicious. What had started as a passionate affair quickly spiraled into something darker. Matthew had always been possessive, wanting Meredith's undivided attention, but lately his jealousy became more pronounced. He noticed Meredith was becoming distant, less attentive to him, and his insecurities began to surface. Matthew was no fool. He could sense that something was off. He began to question her about her time, her whereabouts, and who else she might be seeing. His possessiveness intensified, driving him to show up unannounced at her clinic, watching her interactions with other patients, trying to catch her in a lie. The relationship that once made Meredith feel alive now left her feeling trapped and suffocated. At the same time, Daniel Ward, the emotionally fragile 28-year-old, was becoming more reliant on Meredith's support. His anxiety had worsened, and he depended on her for comfort during his darkest moments. Meredith had blurred the lines between doctor and confidant, And now Daniel saw her as his only source of emotional stability. His late-night calls became more frequent, and his need for constant reassurance was overwhelming. Meredith was torn between her guilt for encouraging his dependency and the fear that cutting him off would devastate him. Yet Daniel's suffocating neediness was draining her, making her realize just how deeply she had allowed herself to become enmeshed in his life. Meanwhile, Aaron Cole's obsession with Meredith was becoming dangerous. The young artist, driven by raw emotion, was no longer content with the secretive nature of their relationship. His passion for Meredith had evolved into something far more intense, bordering on possessive rage. He began showing up at her home, leaving cryptic notes on her car, and even waiting outside her clinic for hours, demanding her attention. Aaron's volatile behavior frightened Meredith, but she couldn't seem to pull away. His passion both captivated and terrified her. As his obsession deepened, Aaron issued an ultimatum. He threatened to expose their affair if Meredith didn't leave Matthew and Daniel behind. He was tired of being kept in the shadows and wanted her all to himself. His threats were not idle. Aaron had become increasingly unstable, and Meredith knew he was capable of following through. The fear of having her entire secret life exposed haunted her, as the consequences would be devastating. Aaron's ultimatum left her trapped, knowing that any decision she made would have catastrophic consequences. The once exciting escapades had turned into a nightmare. Meredith's life was spiraling out of control, with Matthew's growing suspicion, Daniel's emotional dependency, and Aaron's dangerous obsession threatening to unravel everything. She was caught in a deadly triangle of jealousy and desperation, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The breaking point in Dr. Meredith Larsson's tangled web came with the death of Aaron Cole, the youngest and most volatile of her three lovers. Aaron was found dead in his apartment under suspicious circumstances, and the news sent shockwaves through the quiet town of Salsbury. The community was horrified, and whispers of scandal began to circulate. Aaron's death initially appeared to be a suicide, with his body found surrounded by empty pill bottles. However, as investigators delved deeper into the scene, it quickly became clear that something was amiss. The medications in his system, all prescribed by Meredith, were in dangerously high doses, far beyond what she had ever recommended. Investigators began to question whether Aaron had been pushed over the edge or if something more sinister was at play. The positioning of Aaron's body raised immediate red flags. He was found lying unnaturally on the floor, as if someone had staged the scene. The pill bottle was placed too neatly beside him, and a faint bruise on his wrist suggested a struggle. Investigators also noticed that certain items in his apartment were slightly out of place, as though someone had been there with him during his final moments. These details made it impossible to dismiss the idea of foul play. As detectives pieced together the events leading to Aaron's death, they realized that his obsession with Meredith might have played a key role. His threatening behavior, his emotional instability, and his ultimatum to Meredith just days before his death pointed to a volatile situation that may have spiraled out of control. But the question remained, did Aaron overdose on his own, or had someone, perhaps Meredith or one of the other men, played a hand in his demise? With suspicion looming over Meredith and her involvement in Aaron's life, the investigation into his death intensified. It was clear that Aaron's passing was no accident, and as investigators dug deeper, the secrets Meredith had worked so hard to keep hidden began to surface. Aaron's death would become the catalyst that unraveled the entire web of lies, obsession, and betrayal that had been spinning out of control in Meredith's life. As the investigation into Aaron Cole's death unfolded, detectives Sarah Cohen and Mark Jacobs were assigned to the case. Their initial task was to determine whether Aaron's death was a tragic suicide or something far more sinister. It didn't take long for the investigation to veer toward foul play as they uncovered the tangled relationships that Aaron had been involved in, all of which led back to one woman, Dr. Meredith Larsson. At first glance, Meredith appeared to be a well-respected and accomplished physician, admired by the town for her decades of service. However, as Sarah and Mark began to dig deeper into Aaron's life, they uncovered disturbing connections between Meredith and three of her male patients, Matthew Granger, Daniel Ward, and Aaron Cole. Each of these men had a close personal relationship with Meredith, that went far beyond the bounds of typical doctor-patient interactions. The more they learned, the more it became clear that Meredith had been entangled in these men's lives in ways that were deeply inappropriate, even dangerous. The detective's attention turned to Aaron's obsession with Meredith. Through interviews with his friends and family, they learned that Aaron had become increasingly fixated on her in the months leading up to his death. He would frequently talk about her, his mood swinging between intense infatuation and rage. He had even begun making threats that he would expose their affair if Meredith didn't cut ties with her other lovers. Text messages retrieved from Aaron's phone confirmed these suspicions, with Aaron repeatedly demanding that Meredith leave Matthew and Daniel. His messages grew more unhinged as the days passed, signaling his spiraling emotional state. Meredith, in her text to Aaron, had tried to calm him down, urging him to seek professional help and maintain their secrecy. But her responses hinted at fear that Aaron's emotional instability could lead to him exposing everything, destroying not just her career but her entire life. As Sarah and Mark pieced together this information, they realized that Aaron's death was not just the result of personal anguish, but part of a much larger and more complicated story. The detectives also interviewed Matthew and Daniel, both of whom had different reactions when questioned about Meredith and Aaron. Matthew, always possessive, became defensive, claiming he barely knew Aaron and insisting he had nothing to do with his death. Daniel, on the other hand, was visibly anxious, stammering through his responses and betraying signs of emotional fragility that only fueled the detectives' suspicions. Both men had been deeply involved with Meredith, and their relationships with her were now under scrutiny. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Meredith's life had spun out of control long before Aaron's death. What had started as secretive affairs had spiraled into a web of jealousy, obsession, and emotional manipulation. Aaron's threats to reveal their relationship were only the tip of the iceberg, and detectives Cohen and Jacobs were determined to uncover the full truth behind Aaron's death and Meredith's dangerous double life. As detectives Sarah Cohen and Mark Jacobs continued their investigation into Aaron Cole's suspicious death, the evidence increasingly pointed to foul play. Aaron's phone records revealed a flurry of late-night texts exchanged between him and Dr. Meredith Larsson in the days leading up to his death. The messages painted a picture of a deeply troubled relationship. Aaron's texts were frantic, emotional, and at times threatening. He was clearly at the breaking point. In contrast, Meredith's responses were calm, but laced with fear, attempting to placate Aaron and prevent him from exposing their affair. The detectives' focus quickly shifted to the two other men in Meredith's life, Matthew Granger and Daniel Ward, both of whom had complicated relationships with her. Their involvement with Meredith, combined with the volatile dynamic between all three men, raised the possibility that one of them could be involved in Aaron's death. Matthew, the confident and possessive personal trainer, was the first to be questioned. When confronted, he admitted to his romantic relationship with Meredith, though his demeanor quickly shifted from arrogance to defensiveness. Matthew denied any involvement in Aaron's death, insisting that he barely knew the man. But the detectives weren't convinced. His jealousy and suspicious behavior in the months before Aaron's death had made him a prime suspect. He had a motive. Aaron was threatening the very relationship Matthew had fought to control. Daniel, on the other hand, reacted very differently under questioning. Emotionally fragile and clearly on edge, Daniel stumbled through his responses, unable to maintain eye contact with the detectives. His anxiety was palpable. When asked about his relationship with Aaron, Daniel hesitated before making a stunning confession. He had been present at Aaron's apartment the night of his death. According to Daniel, he hadn't intended for anything to happen. He claimed that he had only gone to Aaron's place to talk, driven by his own jealousy and concern over Aaron's relationship with Meredith. Daniel described how Aaron had been in a highly agitated state, talking about ending it all. Panicking, Daniel admitted to staying with Aaron as he took pill after pill, spiraling into despair. He insisted that he didn't intend for Aaron to die and that he simply didn't know how to stop him. This confession left detectives with more questions than answers. While Daniel's emotional fragility made his story somewhat believable, his presence at the scene of Aaron's death pointed to something far more sinister. His inability to act, coupled with his own dependency on Meredith, suggested a deeper level of emotional entanglement. Had Daniel, in his desperation, crossed the line and allowed Aaron to overdose? Or was there something more calculated at play? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that all three men, Aaron, Matthew, and Daniel, had been caught in a dangerous triangle of jealousy and obsession, with Meredith at the center. The detectives were left to untangle the web of lies and manipulation to determine who was truly responsible for Aaron Cole's death. The investigation into Aaron Cole's death took a dramatic turn when Daniel Ward, one of Dr. Meredith Larsson's troubled patients, made a chilling confession. After hours of questioning, Daniel finally broke down, revealing the dark truth about what had happened on the night of Aaron's death. In a trembling voice, he admitted that he had given Aaron the pills that led to his overdose, though he insisted he never intended for things to end that way. According to Daniel, he had gone to Aaron's apartment that night, consumed by jealousy and desperation. He knew about Aaron's intense relationship with Meredith, and his fragile mental state had worsened as he realized Meredith's attention was divided. When he arrived, Aaron was already in a highly emotional and unstable state. Aaron had been ranting about his life spiraling out of control, his obsession with Meredith, and how he couldn't take it anymore. Daniel claimed he just wanted to calm him down, to help him find peace, but what unfolded was far more disturbing. Daniel watched as Aaron took the pills erratically, one after another. Aaron's behavior was chaotic and self-destructive, and Daniel, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, didn't intervene. He stood by as Aaron's actions spiraled out of control, believing that it was inevitable. In his mind, Aaron was already determined to end his life, and Daniel felt powerless to stop it. "I didn't know what to do," Daniel confessed tearfully. "I thought if I just let him take the pills, maybe it would calm him down." But he kept taking more and more. Daniel's confession painted a tragic picture of a man consumed by his own emotional turmoil, incapable of stopping Aaron's self-destruction. He hadn't physically forced the pills on Aaron, but his inaction had sealed Aaron's fate. He admitted that part of him believed that Aaron's death was inevitable. Whether it was that night or another, he thought Aaron would eventually meet the same end. This belief, combined with his own emotional fragility, led him to stand by and watch as Aaron overdosed. Despite Daniel's claim that he didn't mean for Aaron to die, his confession left detectives with an uneasy feeling. His passive role in Aaron's death, combined with his emotional dependency on Meredith, raised deeper questions. Had Daniel's jealousy and desperation led him to silently encourage Aaron's overdose, knowing it would eliminate his rival for Meredith's affection? Or was he simply too broken to stop what he saw unfolding before him? With Daniel's confession, the detectives now had a clearer picture of what had happened that night. But the moral and legal implications of his involvement were far more complex. While he hadn't directly killed Aaron, his inaction and emotional manipulation had played a significant role in the tragedy. As the investigation continued, the detectives would need to determine just how much responsibility Daniel bore for Aaron Cole's death, and whether there was still more to the story than what Daniel had revealed. As the investigation progressed, Detectives Sarah Cohen and Mark Jacobs began to suspect that Dr. Meredith Larsson's involvement went far deeper than just a series of inappropriate relationships. While Daniel Ward's confession provided insight into the night of Aaron Cole's death, there were lingering questions about Meredith's role in the entire situation. Could she have manipulated Daniel into confronting Aaron? Was she the orchestrator behind the tragic events that unfolded? The relationships Meredith had with Matthew, Daniel, and Aaron became central to the investigation. Each man had been drawn into her life in deeply personal and emotional ways, and it seemed that Meredith had carefully compartmentalized her interactions with each of them. The detectives were now questioning whether Meredith, in her need to be desired and in control, had set the wheels of this tragedy in motion. Daniel's emotional fragility, in particular, stood out. He had relied on Meredith not just for medical care, but for emotional support, and she had fostered a deep sense of dependency in him. As detectives combed through messages, phone calls, and testimony from those around her, they noticed a pattern. Meredith had a way of making herself indispensable to these men. She had allowed Daniel's emotional attachment to grow unchecked, blurring the line between doctor and lover, and in doing so had made him vulnerable to manipulation. Detectives began to theorize that Meredith had subtly influenced Daniel to confront Aaron on that fateful night. While there was no direct evidence that she had explicitly told him to intervene, her constant reassurances to him about Aaron, her soothing words, and her knowledge of Daniel's emotional state made it seem plausible that Daniel might have felt compelled to act on her behalf. After all, Aaron had become increasingly volatile, threatening to expose their relationship, and Meredith had much to lose. Was it possible that she had quietly encouraged Daniel, knowing he was emotionally fragile enough to act out of jealousy or desperation? Matthew Granger, too, had become possessive and jealous over time, often showing up unannounced and demanding Meredith's time. The detectives wondered if she had manipulated each man in different ways, playing on their emotions to maintain control over them, perhaps without fully realizing the consequences. She had become the center of their worlds, and each man's relationship with her was fraught with jealousy, dependency, and ultimately, danger. As detectives pieced together the timeline of events, they noticed that Meredith had expertly managed these relationships for months, perhaps even years, keeping each man separate while maintaining her secret affairs. But the stress of managing three emotionally volatile men had likely pushed her to her breaking point, and Aaron's threats of exposure had tipped the delicate balance she had maintained. Daniel, deeply reliant on Meredith and emotionally fragile, had become the unwitting pawn in this deadly game. With each new piece of evidence, it became increasingly clear that Meredith's manipulation of these men, particularly Daniel, could have directly led to Aaron's death. Whether or not she had intended for it to end in tragedy, her actions had set in motion a series of events that spiraled out of her control. The detectives were left to determine just how much influence Meredith had exerted and whether her manipulations had turned her from a beloved doctor into the puppet master behind a deadly confrontation. During the trial, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Dr. Meredith Larsson, arguing that she had exploited her position of authority to manipulate emotionally vulnerable men, ultimately leading to Aaron Cole's death. They focused on her inappropriate relationships with Matthew Granger, Daniel Ward, and Aaron, highlighting how she crossed professional boundaries and created a dangerous web of jealousy and dependency. The prosecution contended that Meredith's manipulation of Daniel played a direct role in Aaron's tragic overdose, whether intentional or not. The defense, however, portrayed Meredith as a caring but misguided doctor who had made poor personal decisions but was not responsible for Aaron's death. They argued that Meredith never intended harm and that Daniel acted independently in his confrontation with Aaron. They framed her actions as those of a woman seeking connection in her later years, not someone maliciously manipulating her patients for control. While admitting that Meredith had crossed ethical lines, the defense denied any direct responsibility for Aaron's fatal overdose, suggesting that the blame lay with Daniel's actions and Aaron's emotional instability. The trial concluded with a devastating outcome for Dr. Meredith Larsson. She was found guilty of professional misconduct and lost her medical license, the career she had built over 40 years. While the court stopped short of prison time, Meredith was sentenced to probation, acknowledging the severity of her ethical violations. The town of Salsbury, once viewing Meredith as a beloved and trusted physician, was left in shock. Aaron Cole's death, paired with the revelations of Meredith's secret affairs, shattered her once sterling reputation, leaving the community devastated and divided. Meredith, stripped of her career, respect, and dignity, was left to face the aftermath of her actions, alone and disgraced, having lost everything she had worked for. Meredith's secret life of emotional manipulation and inappropriate relationships spiraled out of control, leading to obsession, betrayal, and ultimately, tragedy. What began as an attempt to fill an emotional void turned into a web of deceit, where vulnerable men became pawns in her dangerous game. Aaron's death was the ultimate consequence of Meredith's inability to maintain the boundaries between her personal desires and professional responsibilities. In the end, her choices not only cost her career and reputation, but also left behind a legacy of pain, betrayal, and loss. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions and any suggestions for future content. And of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.